Welcome to the Weights and Plates podcast. I am Robert Santana. I am your host, along with Trent Jones, my co-host.
Howdy, sir. How's it going, man?
Good, man. How are you?
I'm good. So I've been running your rotating linear progression idea.
Yeah.
Myself over the last few months.
Okay.
And it's interesting. So I've run into a little bit of a roadblock lately. And I expected this to happen. Frankly, it took longer to happen than I thought it would. So in September, we had a son. And so he was born September 17th. And I took basically 2 weeks off of training. And then I started back in basically, so the first week of October, I started lifting again, just doing like 2 sets of each of the main lifts. So 1 lift per day, 2 working sets on each of those lifts. So 4 total lifts per week. Very low volume. And then after a few weeks of doing that and adjusting to kind of the new rhythm of life and stuff, I started on a proper rotating linear progression. So I did squat, bench, press, and deadlift, starting with sets of 8. And I would run my 8s up as far as I could until I couldn't hit 8 reps anymore. And then I dropped down to like 6s, 5s, and then triples. And then at Christmas, I tried to run out some singles just for the heck of it,
Yeah.
And then I reset again. So here I am. And I've basically run into a wall with bench and deadlift, and it's a pretty hard wall. Interestingly, though, my squat has continued to progress. Like my squats are crushing it. My presses are moving along just fine, making small incremental gains on each of these rep ranges. But I thought it was interesting. So like I've basically now been running this very simple rotating linear progression, doing. In total, let's see, I'm doing 2 working sets of 8 on the squat. I'm doing 3 working sets of 8 on the bench and press, and then a single working set of 8 on the deadlift.
Okay.
And, so what's that been? October, November, December, January, and here we are just about to go into February. So that's about, give or take, if you kind of discount the first month of doing that, because I was really just kind of, just hanging on. That's about 3 solid months of progress on my 8s and 6s, and and then just kind of running up to some decently high numbers, but not PRs on my 5s and 3s.
Right.
So I thought that was pretty good, but now I've run into a really hard wall on my bench and deadlift, and I'm gonna have to figure out what I need to do to get that moving again.
Well, as we always say, you want to look at that in terms of, is it stress issue? Too much stress? Is it not enough recovery? What are you thinking?
Well, I think, I don't know. That might actually be 2 different answers there. I think for the bench press, it's for sure not enough stress. Because in the past, I've run into this too. Like my bench, I think like a lot of people's bench, favors frequency, right? So the more frequency that you can introduce, the more, as you get advanced, the more frequency you can introduce, usually the better your bench responds to that. And I'm only benching once a week, and I'm only doing 3 working sets. So, compared to like more traditional intermediate programs, I'm doing very low volume. And I'm also kind of light right now.
Okay.
Relative to what I've been in the past. And we've talked about that on the show, how, if you're light and you just have less mass around your chest, then that can negatively impact your bench. So that's my guess there. On the deadlift, I'm not quite sure. So last time around when I went down to 5s, on my deadlift, I went from like I think I ran out at like 375 on a set of 8. And then when I switched to 5s, I ran that up to 405 for a set of 5. Well, after Christmas, a little bit of reset, I got sick and all that kind of stuff. I ran my 8s up to 370 on the deadlift. I switched to 5s. I got to 395. And then last week I did 405, and I thought I was going to hit it for a set of 5. No, I got 2 doubles.
Oh,
just smoked, absolutely smoked. So I don't know. I don't know if that's a recovery issue. I'm pulling too frequently because I'm trying to pull heavy every week, or what? Or maybe it's a volume issue again. Maybe I need more volume. Not quite sure.
Deadlift's tricky because it could be easily impacted by the squat too.
That's my other thought. Yeah. As my squat's been going up the whole time, I just set a PR for 2 sets of 8.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
It probably wrecked. You probably need to start spreading it out over 2, 3, 4 weeks.
Yeah, I think that's probably what I do. But it's kind of weird because I feel like because I'm only doing like one lift per day, 4 days a week, it feels like I'm not doing hardly anything. So it's like, yeah, of course I should be recovered from my deadlift.
Yeah, I know,
like,
but
I'm not doing anything.
That's the funny thing. You're doing a lot.
Yeah. So anyway, yeah, I thought that was kind of an interesting little anecdote there. But I'll let you know. I'll report back in a couple months and let you know how I resolve that and see if I can get those numbers moving up again. Because 405 for 5, when I hit that I hit that in December, that tied a PR for me. And I'm like, I want more. I want to drive that 5 RM up, maybe 415, 425.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you'll get there. I know that I see it a lot in the gym where that squat gets up there and keeps going, and the deadlift just crashes. That first inch, it's can easily shut down if the back is too fatigued. It becomes a limiting factor on both of the lifts, but especially in the deadlift because you have that isometric component in the beginning.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny now that you mentioned that. I'm actually remembering. I've had this feeling the last few weeks when I've been deadlifting where, like, I just can't set my upper back. Mm-hmm. Like I know what to do. I've done thousands of deadlifts. I know how to set my upper back, but it's just not there. Like I'm going to set it, and it's just kind of it feels weak as I'm trying to squeeze it up. So maybe that's just residual fatigue that's been creeping in. So, well, anyway, I bring that up to say that I think that's kind of an element of intermediate training, right? Is that at some point you kind of have to push one thing up at the expense of something else, right? So, if you're going crazy on your squat, your deadlift may have to take a back seat for a period of time. I don't think that means that you can't move your deadlift up at all. It's just that there are times where you're kind of playing whack-a-mole. And I think that actually kind of fits the theme of today's topic today pretty well. And so today we wanted to talk about what do you do when you become an intermediate lifter. And, we're sticking with our theme of the skinny fat trainee, right? So what happens when you're a skinny fat lifter and you've gone through the novice program and you've done everything that we talked about in the recent episodes, right? And now you're an intermediate and you've probably gained some substantial muscle mass in this process, but you're not quite there, right? Your physique is not where you want it to be yet, but now you're in the intermediate land and you got to make some decisions about what you're going to do next.
Right. Yeah, typically these guys, they'll come to me. They've been training for a while. Their numbers are pretty decent, coming in. And, they'll complain that, hey, I got strong and, I'm stronger than I've ever been. And I just, I still feel like I'm fat. So how do I lose the fat, So that typically is the priority that this person is focused on. So you might the skinny fat lifter we're talking about is somebody who made a conscious decision to put the fat aside to get strong as a novice. By this point, they're strong. You're not a big, fat, sloppy mess, but, you're not defined and you care about aesthetics. You want to look like you train. You want to look, you want more visible musculature. This is kind of the person I'm talking about. And your goal is not to be a competitive power lifter. And this person might come and say, I've gotten all this strength, but I need to lose the fat. How do I do it? And, it's the same way anybody else does it. You have to eat fewer calories than you're expending. You got to keep protein up to hold on to muscle mass. And you got to maximize how many carbs you can lose weight on to minimize performance decrements. And in this process, your body's changing, right, in a different way, right? When you're building, you're getting larger. Your shoulders are getting broader, your traps are growing, your legs are growing. You're putting on fat and muscle. Now your body's changing the other way. You're losing body fat, and you're becoming a smaller body, right? So,
right, yeah.
And that has a learning curve of its own. You're going to learn how to lift with a smaller body. You don't have this large mass to move around, so it makes lifting more difficult. Oftentimes, it's not unusual for the squat to go down just because of this. So, you have a few things that drive strength. Muscle mass drives strength, obviously, but so does leverage. A larger body mass will have more leverage than a smaller body mass.
Yeah, when your belt's feeling like super tight and you hit the hole and you got that extra cushion around the middle, it feels nice on a squat.
So, Yeah, now you might have to artificially lower the squat, work it back up, get used to squatting without a belly, or even a mini belly, or whatever.
Yeah, it doesn't take much. It's like if you lose like a couple inches on your waist, that's a huge change in the feel of a squat.
Yeah, exactly. And by this point, you're gonna lose body fat, and you're probably going to get down to a lighter body weight, but you're going to be more defined at that body weight than you were years ago. So let's say if you started at 165, 175 skinny fat, you pushed your weight up to 195, 200 pounds and trained and got strong. Now when you're going down, you might start seeing more visible shoulders, arms, abs a little bit, quads, etc. Whereas before, there wasn't a whole lot going on at that body weight. And, we typically... that's typically the first thing that this lifter wants to address, and that's typically how we address it. The next thing is typically weak points, right? Like so for me, my weak point's always been my biceps. They just never really grew. And as I'm learning more about this bodybuilding stuff, and I've been following Baker's ARM program, I learned through that process that the reason I was struggling with elbow flexion type movements was because my grip was a limiting factor. And I didn't know that because I never dropped a deadlift. So, I could secure a hook grip, but I lacked hand grip strength. And when I started training hand grip strength with the hand grippers, the Captains of Crush, suddenly curling and rowing got a lot easier. And now I have resting biceps. They're not huge by any means, but, I notice a visible difference in my videos, despite the fact that, I've gained weight and become a little less defined than at the bottom of my last cut. Those muscles are now, more prominent. And so, that could be any muscle for anybody who's in this position. So how do you address that? At this point, throwing in some accessory work could be useful. You have a foundation of strength at this point. You may not be as strong as you ever want to get, but you're pretty strong. You're strong enough to, decide you're cool with losing some body fat. So, if it's time to do some arm curls, okay, you can do some arm curls. By this point, you're probably doing 10 chin-ups, or 5 to 10 chin-ups, depending on body weight. So, let's throw in some arm curls. For other guys, they'll sit there and say, my quads, I didn't really see any quad growth. Okay, well, maybe add some leg presses in there, or, high bar squat one day, low bar squat one day, maybe front squat, throw in some, some Olympic lifting,
Yeah, I know Andy really likes a super deep front squat to get this maximum knee flexion at the bottom of front squat, get a long range of motion on the quadriceps.
And, at this point, it gets covered pretty extensively in the practical programming book, but once you're no longer a novice, let's just kind of go back to basic principles here. When you're no longer a novice, you have to decide where you want to put your energy,
right?
For a lot of us coaches, we've decided to put our energy into pushing more PRs, bigger sets of 5, bigger sets of 3, bigger singles, 1RMs,
right?
Competitions in some case. I did a few meets. And that became where my emphasis was because I didn't feel like I was strong enough yet. So, that might happen also, in which case you want more modest weight loss so that you don't interfere with that process, followed by modest weight gain. And, you kind of settle into a weight range where you can keep pushing more and more PRs. But
and that's I want to underline that point. So that's a big thing about intermediate training. I've just had, so I tend to do like biannual conversations with all of my lifters. And I've talked to a couple of guys who are now like getting into intermediate territory. And that's one of the things I said is, your goals drive everything at this point. So things get a lot more individualized. And so you have to set a clear goal to have a direction. When you're a novice, it's easy because the goal is strength. Regardless of what your long-term goal is, the goal is strength because we know that strength is going to make everything else better to a point, right? And when you get to intermediate territory, now we've hit that to a point conversation, right? Which is that if in order to get better at X, you have to sacrifice a little bit of Y, right? And so that's huge, right? It's just identifying what it is that you want. Because I think sometimes people are like, well, they're like, yeah, I want to look better. You're like, okay, cool. So here's how we would do that. And then then they hear like, oh, well, I'm not going to get stronger on my 1RMs. You're like, well, probably not for at least a little while. And they're like, well, I want more 1RMs though. I was like, okay, which one do you want? You have, to some extent, you have to pick a direction to put your emphasis. And I think that's really important to understand, because if you start chasing aesthetics, that's fine, but just realize it's going to come at the cost of, absolute weight on the bar for a 1RM for a period of time at least.
Yeah, you really have to be at a point where you don't care about big single PR, like 1RMs and 3-rep PRs, 5-rep PRs. And like, for instance, I've been training this way for 6 months now for hypertrophy, quote unquote, hypertrophy. Basically higher reps, higher sets, higher volume, higher reps, right? More exercises, so I'm just more tired, right? But it's still done in a progressive way. I went into this with the mentality that, okay, I don't want to lose weight off my squat and deadlift, so I'm going to train those the same, And I'm also not really concerned about building a bigger back or legs. I think that'll keep happening, squatting and deadlifting. So that was number one. But then upper body, I was just, I pressed 225. Sure, I'd like to press more than that, but at the rate that's going to go at this point is going to be really slow, and I don't think it's going to be a great growth stimulus at this point because of how slow that lift is progressing, right? My bench press, unless I get fat and get more leverage, it doesn't move. So I'm trying to figure out how to make that move through increases in muscle tissue. So, I went in and started training this way, knowing that I'm not going to have a big press, I'm not going to have a big bench, right? And, that doesn't bother me. But if that bothers you, if you want bigger PRs, a specific lift that includes those muscle groups you're trying to develop, you're setting yourself up for frustration. Now, that said, in the beginning, when you're an intermediate or advanced lifter, the beginning of a training program starts with higher volume, lower intensity, moderate intensity, whatever word you want to use, and moves towards higher intensity, lower volume, right? And you could do some of that stuff for a few weeks, but you're not going to dedicate months to that because, if your goal is PRs, it's going to fatigue you, and you're not going to be able to push maximal weights. So it's, typically skinny fat guy, wants to, have visible musculature. So at some point, more physique-oriented type training becomes necessary. Now, somebody's going to ask me, but, you always say that strength, it's all strength, right? Well, it is all strength, but let's say, let's say you got your squat to, 405, right? Okay, you could push it to 500, right? How long is that going to take, and what typically becomes a limiting factor? So when you're thinking about physique-oriented training, first of all, and an intermediate skinny fat guy is, most likely, and it applies in this case because he's post-novice. When you're thinking about physique-oriented training, it's a totally different mindset. Like, I did a whole episode with Andy on it. We were talking about it, and, you want to remove the limiting factor from certain lifts so that you could target certain muscles. So on the squat, as it gets heavier, the low back becomes a limiting factor. Some people have said the core, but it's mostly the low back, right? So, you end up pushing your legs less frequently because your back is taking so long to recover. Does that mean that your legs need that much recovery? Probably not. You could probably leg press and keep going, and do more, get more work done that way. That's why these bodybuilders train that way, right?
Right.
So it's the same thing. Like for me, my limiting factor was my hands. My hand grip was weak. I got it stronger. Now I can curl a lot more, But before, all the curling my forearms would fatigue before my biceps, right? And unlike, things like rows where you can use straps to remove that, you can't. That's not really going to do the same thing on curls. You need your hands to get stronger and outpace or stay on pace or close to pace with your biceps. So my whole point is you start thinking about that, right? Like if you want to target a certain muscle, yes, your quads will grow from squatting heavier, but your squat is going up slower as you advance, right? So you have to take that into consideration as part of the equation. Yes, you want a bigger squat, but what do you care more about? Do you want to grow your legs or do you want to grow your squat? Yes, if you grow your squat, you will grow your legs, but your squat's growing slow, right? And you could hit your legs with more work doing something else at this stage. Remember, novices, this doesn't apply to you. And if you're a weak intermediate, if you finish your LP and you're, you're a male, of adult age and squatting, barely over body weight, you really should keep prioritizing strength. I think that's an important thing to touch on. Like, the guy squatting 275 for a max, who's an intermediate, this legitimately happens. I think you just need to get your squat up.
Right. Yeah. And exactly right. Absolute weight on the bar matters. And there's like we said, when we had Andy on the show, right? I tried to ask him like, what are your sort of your standards? And it's really, it's kind of a landmine or a minefield, I should say, talking about strength standards, because like your size and your frame matters so much. Like a guy that's 5'4", and 165 pounds is going to have a different standard, quote unquote, of being strong than a dude who's 6'3", 265, right? Like just totally different animals there. But yeah, you're right. Like the absolute weight on the bar matters. If you're squatting 275 for 3 sets of 5, or 315, or 350 for 3 sets of 5, that is a completely different stimulus than squatting 225 or 205 for 3 sets of 5. There's just there are these break points. It's going to be different for everyone, but there are these sort of like levels or break points or whatever you want to call them, where the stimulus changes dramatically in your ability to like impose stress on your body, right, and grow.
Yeah, absolutely. So while a lot of this is relative and individual results vary, there are absolutes here. Squatting 500 pounds is extremely stressful, whether you're 250 or whether you're 185,
Right. Yes, absolutely.
And I've talked to larger guys that say that. I remember there was a 700-pound deadlifter I knew way back, and I was mentioning how Rip says, 500 is not that heavy. I can do it right now. He used to say that at seminars.
Yeah.
And then he's like, dude, 500 is still heavy for me,
Yeah, right.
Like, the absolute starts to matter when you start, getting up into those big numbers, and, your size doesn't really play a role in that in terms of recovery, right? If you're doing a bunch of volume with 500 plus pound deadlifts or 500 plus pound squats, assuming you're not on performance enhancing drugs, that's going to take a lot out of you no matter who you are, So let's just kind of keep that in context, right? If you're squatting 275, that's going to get you some growth, obviously, but, what guy do you know with large leg musculature that struggles to squat 275 unless they haven't done it before? You start training them, they get there pretty quick and pass it,
Right.
So, you're better served getting stronger than that. Double body weight squat's pretty good. If you could do that for a set of 5, that's even better, If you do that for a set of 10, now you're an enthusiast. That's kind of where I'm at,
Yeah.
But, let's say some good milestones. So, like, I guess, okay, does it really have to do with training advancement level, like intermediate versus advanced, et cetera? Somewhat, yes. But let's add some context to this. I think that a good milestone for, a novice / early intermediate is, assuming you're not, over fat, obese, whatever word you want to use, if you're normal size, whatever that means, and that does not mean 9% body fat, but let's say 15 to 25% body fat. Just throw some objective numbers out there, right?
Yeah.
A 2.5 times body weight deadlift, a double body weight squat, a 1.5 body weight bench press, and a body weight press with 5 to 10 chin-ups are some pretty good places to be in terms of strength,
Yeah.
Those aren't earth-shattering numbers, and this is for a male. For a female, I typically say 2 times body weight on the deadlift, 1.5 on the squat, 75% of body weight on the press, and body weight bench press, body weight bench press are some good milestones for a female. And this is, adult, not elderly, not, no special cases here, you should probably work hard to get to those milestones because you're going to look pretty good there, and, getting beyond that, do you really need to? Probably not, probably not. You could probably do some hypertrophy stuff or you could cycle back and forth, none of these things are absolutes, but
yeah,
you kind of want to get reasonably strong. You don't want to be, you don't want a 185 pound bench press as a man and then you're just, doing tens with like 95 pounds,
Right. Yeah.
I've been down that road. There's something about getting that absolute number up that is valuable that we probably can't really measure or explain, But once you start getting up there in excess of body weight, you start to use more productive loads, I think.
Yes.
Although, the science people argue that that's bullshit, but that's fine. This is just my experience with it and training people, training myself. I think that it's important to get that strong. And I think part of it is, too, the neuromuscular efficiency. In one of my articles, I recently said, how is more neuromuscular efficiency going to be a bad thing in terms of hypertrophy, right? You get used to handling these earth-shattering weights for you. That is relative, because, 1,000 pounds, 500 pounds, like 400 pounds,
first time you do it, it's earth-shattering. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, if you're squatting 300 to 500 pounds as a guy, that's pretty earth-shattering,
Yes.
And there's guys that go beyond that. That's I have no experience with that, but I'd imagine that's even more intense. And getting used to handling that is only going to help if you're pumping out, no bullshit hard sets of 10, because you're going to be able to manage it better. When I do a set of 10 now, the first rep feels as hard as the last rep almost, and I'm able to handle it, and I'm able to understand that because I've squatted well over 400 pounds,
Right. Yeah, it's absolutely. Yeah, there's definitely a feel thing there, right? And it's it's kind of like in baseball, you put the donut on your bat to make your bat heavier, and you take some cuts with it, right? And you take it off, and you're like, oh man, it feels so light. It's not that you are actually swinging the bat faster per se. Maybe you are, maybe you aren't, but the feel changes, and that's very subjective. But it does change. And that's the same thing when you push that's part of the reason why often in a lot of cases we will push a novice at the very end of novice linear progression up to higher intensities by dropping the reps, right? So we'll take him from 3 sets of 5 to 5 sets of 3, maybe to like 2 sets of 3 and some back off sets. And then sometimes with some guys, I'll run them all the way up to doubles. So from threes to doubles, and then doubles, and we'll even try some singles at the end of that run. Mainly because it's fun to do. It's kind of fun to hit some heavy singles, but also there's a reason. There is a good reason for that too, and that's that. When you first time you put 405 in your back and you've experienced that, you go back down to a normal working load. And you're going to do sets of 5 at 340 or 330 or whatever, or sets of 8 at 305. Well, yeah, they're much more manageable when you've felt 405 in recent history.
Yeah, and I've heard people say that you don't need to do that, and I'd say that that's probably true if you're pretty strong. But I think some people need to do that. Like if I get somebody that finishes an LP, let's say in the mid to high 200s, 3 sets of 5, I think I think it's valuable to run up singles. They're going to recover from that. But if I get somebody, if it's a 600 squatter, probably true. Yeah, you probably don't need to do singles and max out. It's probably not worth it.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And
unless you're a power lifter, of course.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, that's mostly the people that I'm dealing with. They're running out their LP and I'm usually dealing with a little bit older crowd too, so they don't reach the numbers that a younger guy would. But yeah, they're ending things in the 240, 250 on a squat for 3 sets of 5. So yeah, absolutely. Getting them up towards 300 for whatever reps they can handle definitely helps. So, all right. So I want to kind of circle back here because I'm sure some people are listening to this and they're like, whoa, I thought we were talking about like changing our eating habits as an intermediate so we can get leaner. Well, this stuff matters because, I think Andy said it best when he was on our show. If you want to get bigger and you want to gain muscle mass, and you want to emphasize your physique, you need to get stronger in a medium rep range, right? Which I think he said 4 to 8 reps. I think you could say 4 to 10 reps, somewhere in that rep range, but you need to kind of de-emphasize the heavy stuff for a while, and you need to get stronger in a medium rep range and make those numbers go up, right? And you need to eat to grow while you're doing that. And so I wanted to circle back there because I think that's very important, right? We're all talking about like how do you get from point A to point B? How do you get from the end of that novice phase to prepare yourself to do this work and get the most out of it?
Well, when you're a novice, you're gaining muscle at the fastest rate you're ever going to gain it. You're getting stronger at the fastest rate you're ever going to get stronger. The longer that you train, once you get into early intermediate, especially late intermediate advanced, if your concern is body composition and you're not a competitive lifter, then the weight swings will get smaller over time. So, let's say you gain 40 pounds as a novice, and yes, you're gaining a chunk of fat with that.
Mm-hmm.
And you knew that going in, you didn't care. And you use that to leverage the weight, which, I found that to be helpful. Everything's a series of trade-offs. Life's a series of trade-offs. So when you gain lots of body weight, you're gaining fat and muscle. What I've noticed is lifts like the squat especially become very easy to perform from a skill standpoint when there's a little bit more body fat on the person. And that's because of what we talked about, the leverage. Now, I'm not telling somebody to get, 50-inch waist or to get really obese, because eventually it becomes an impingement. But I've noticed that when a little bit of abdominal fat starts to accumulate, the person just starts moving better, And I think that this is useful in those early phases. This may not be applicable to everybody. If you're older, you probably, and you have a history of high blood pressure or things like that, or that runs in your family, you're at risk for some sort of cardiovascular event. You might not want to get fat, You might not want to max out either, There's situations where it doesn't make sense, but if you're a young man that's otherwise healthy, and you're willing to gain the weight, you don't care that you're gaining fat, and you understand everything that we're explaining here, you're gaining fat, you're leveraging it, it's helping you lift weight more effectively, and it's helping you learn these movements more effectively, then that can be productive. After you get off your LP, you start to lose that, then you got to learn how to move without it. That's a whole learning curve, but the movement part tends to get easier because you've been doing it for so long, and you start to understand what your body's doing in space. So at this point, you may not, instead of sitting around 200, 210, and, you're of normal height, 5'7" to 5'10", right? You might sit at 185 to 195, That might happen. Again, this person is concerned with appearance, physique, not competing on the platform. If you're competing on the platform, now we're talking about competitive strength sports. And, while we want to maximize our health, you also are trying to win. You're also trying to get the biggest weight you can get up, and sometimes that requires being fatter. Look at the top squatters in the world. They have big fat bellies for a reason,
Yep, right.
But that's not what we're talking about here. So I keep repeating myself on this context thing, because I don't want people turning around saying Santana said you got to get fat. That's not what I'm
goals.
saying.
You got to bring it always back to your goal, right? You have to. The goal defines the direction.
Yeah, so goals, right? We're talking about skinny fat guy that has trouble putting on muscle, may or may not have problems getting strong. Typically, they don't get extremely strong, but they can get strong, Guys who get extremely strong tend to get muscular too, to some extent. We've talked about that in other episodes. But, if you have appearance in the back of your mind, and then at some point you're going to cut weight, you're going to lose weight off your extreme strength, your maximum strength, right? So your 1RMs, your 3RMs. But you're going to hold on to your muscle mass, and you're going to bring up weak areas through, various assistance exercises or ancillary exercises. And, you're going to, it's the same kind of principle as you're going to cut weight during periods of high volume and lower intensity. And you're going to build and gain weight during periods of, lower volume, and that's relatively speaking. So, you might run 10s when you're cutting. You might run 8s, 5s, when you're building,
Yeah, I wanted to ask about that a little bit more. I wanted to kind of get your experience with this. So when somebody is, let's say that we've got an average height male, and he's 200 pounds, right? Like you said before. So 5'7" to 5'10", they weigh 200 pounds, and they're like, okay, I decided I want to focus on physique. I want to cut. So they decide to cut down to 185, 190 kind of range. So they cut 10, 15 pounds. While they're on that cut, do you find that most guys are able to make progress on, let's say, assistance lifts? Not necessarily like squat, bench, deadlift, but like curls, leg presses, hack squats, whatever their sort of assistance lift of choice is to bring up, to emphasize muscle growth. Do you find that they're able to make progress on those, or are they kind of just treading water while they do the cut and waiting to gain?
It depends. If they haven't trained those movements before, I've made progress on certain movements while I was cutting because I hadn't trained them before.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, right?
Yeah. So again, it depends how adapted you are. The more adapted you are to a movement, the less likely it is that you're going to gain muscle while you're underfeeding yourself.
Yeah, so that's what I was thinking. So we could maybe take advantage of that, right? So if you are, so if you're an early intermediate, right, you don't have a lot of experience training outside of the main lifts.
Right.
Reasonably, I think, you might get on the leg press and have no idea what you can do, right? So you kind of maybe do a couple workouts, kind of figure out where a decent starting point is, and then you start progressing from there. I would imagine that even if you're losing weight, you probably can drive that leg press up, for a good long while, just because it's novel to you. Or you could say the same thing about a curl, a hack squat, whatever, tricep extension or whatever. So, but just because of that, basically you can take advantage of the novice effect and sort of get progress even though you're in a caloric restriction.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right.
Okay, so all right, so this trainee, they're going to cut, somewhere in the odds of like 10 to 15 pounds. That's what, like 5% of their body weight, roughly.
Yep, that's right.
And then, so they end up in this new place. They've probably see some definition now that they've cut this weight. What does it look like kind of long term from there? Are they going to just kind of bulk and cut to continue improving their physique, or do you recommend that people like kind of stay at maintenance for a while?
Maintenance is bullshit. But I've thought about this
maintenance body weight. Maintenance body weight. That's what I meant, though. So if they get down to 190,
I always tell people to eat to support what they're doing in the weight room. I don't like to use body weight as a metric for progress when you're trying to build muscle. That's my personal thing. All the big name guys will say, you have to gain weight and this and that. And I think that weight gain just happens on its own when you fuel your workouts. I don't think you should try to gain X pounds per week, etc. I find that when people look at it that way, they're focusing on the scale and not their training. The stimulus for growth is the training, and the food you eat fuels the training. And if you're fueling the training correctly, your body weight will go up just fine. You probably, like bodybuilders keep their weight, they claim, I don't know if this is actually true, but they try to, if you're talking to one, they'll say, I'll stay, close to 9% body fat in the off season. And then you'll see them lifting and they have a gut, when they're in the off season.
Right.
So I don't know that I buy into that, but, they tend to be leaner than strength athletes. I think ideally they want to do that, but I don't think it always works out that way unless they're naturally lean to begin with.
I was about to say, I'm remembering, stories and videos I've seen of Lee Priest.
Yeah, he would really bulk up.
Who would go ham on Big Macs and stuff in the off season, get super fat, and then cut way down, and it's pretty extreme.
Yeah, so we're not talking about that, but there's a range. And you want to eat to fuel your training. And if you're trying to, progress week to week, you're going to find that the lifting gets hard, and then you're going to have to eat more. And then when you eat more, your weight goes up. And then eventually you get to a point where you're like, I'm starting to feel a little bit fluffy, or soft, or like my pants are getting tighter, or whatever. There's some sort of indicator that you're probably reaching what you would consider as your upper limit. And meanwhile, your training is progressing because you're recovering and you're training hard. And then at that point, you kind of scale it back to, okay, I'm going to lose a few pounds, get back down to my bottom end, and then work back up. And to give you an example, like myself, right? Once I start dropping below 170, training just sucks, This last time I had a pretty good run, and I don't know why that was, but I did. And once I start getting above 180, I start seeing very little benefit the further I get from 180. If I get from 180 to 190, no difference. My lifts move kind of the same, right?
Yeah, right.
From 170 to 180, things start to go up. I can maintain a lot of that strength in the 170s. Once I start going below 170, I start getting very lean. Looks kind of cool, but I also look kind of sick, So just depends who you're asking, right? And my performance starts to suffer. So one of the things you learn as an intermediate, there's no way that we can predict this or any coach can predict this, is where your upper and lower limits are. Your upper limit typically is where, okay, I'm noticing more fat gain than anything, and my performance isn't really changing compared to 5 pounds ago or something,
Right.
And then your lower limit, you're starting to lose energy. You're starting to feel kind of tired, bogged down. Your workouts are going shitty. You only learn that through experience,
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
some people can't get super lean, some people can't, and usually those are larger guys. They're not skinny fat guys. They're typically fat and strong guys,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I really like that way you put it. So if you're paying attention to the weight on the bar in the correct rep range and with the correct movements for your goals, then and you're eating to fuel that, then you're going to see the results you want. And the body weight will just be something that happens along the way. Yeah, I think that's a great way to look at it. I've stumbled into that. I didn't have really that concept in mind. I wasn't thinking about that over the last 5 years. But I had a Facebook story pop up recently that told me 5 years ago I competed at strength lifting nationals in Oakland, California.
Oh, I remember that.
And I was like, oh man, that was that was 5 years ago.
Six. Was that 5 or 6? That was 5. Yeah, 2018.
5 years ago, I think. Yeah, 2018, I believe, beginning of 2018, and that was the heaviest I'd ever been. So, I did my novice linear progression, and I did some early intermediate training, Texas method and all that kind of stuff. And I pushed my body weight up from 200 to like 205. And then I remember in that next training cycle, I'd gotten into competing. I did a few meets, and I was competing for nationals, and I was already over 200. So I thought, well, I want to try to fill out the 220 or 100 kilo weight class as much as I can. And the heaviest I got was 215, and I think I weighed out on that meet at like 211 or 212. And what's interesting is since in those 5 years since, I sort of gradually, because it was so much effort to maintain that, I had to eat so much all the time to maintain that body weight, I naturally slid down to about 200 over the next few months after that meet. And then I didn't compete for a while. And so I didn't really think about it. I was still trying to lift for strength. I was still in that mindset of like, yeah, I'm going to like eventually do another strength lifting meet. So, I'm still pushing the squat, press, deadlift and all that stuff. But I kind of slid down to 200 and, had to do some resets on my lifts. And I remember getting back to basically where I was at meet day, but at 200 pounds. And then fast forward another couple years, there's ups and downs and resets and whatnot in my training. And all of a sudden now I'm, 195 and I'm doing the same weights I was at 205. And now today I'm 190 and I'm doing the same lifts that I was at, originally at 215. And I found along the way exactly what you just mentioned is that below 190, I start to really feel the downside. Like my lifts fall off really hard. If I get down to like 185, it's just too light for me. But somewhere around 190, 195, I feel great. And I've been able to get my lifts back up to where they were when I was 25 pounds heavier. So that's certainly turned out to be very true for me.
Yeah, that's what happens over time. You start to get stronger and then you get down to a lighter body weight. Then eventually that lighter body weight, that bottom gets higher,
Yeah. Yeah.
It gets higher because you get leaner to heavier body weight if you've continued to train. And typically if you've, started to address weak areas, I suspect when I go down again, I'm going to be heavier and leaner.
That's right. And so that's kind of what I'm looking forward to. Like, so when I get into a phase of life where I can dedicate more time to training again, I suspect that I hopefully will be able to push my body weight up to 195 again, but I'll be more muscular and I'll be the same, essentially as lean as I am now at 190 at 195.
Yeah.
And that difference will be muscle mass.
That's right.
Well, I hope that's been helpful. Sometimes it's kind of hard because like you think you're tuning in for a diet episode, and this is a diet episode, right? But you can't really talk about that without talking about programming, right?
The stimulus is the training. The diet is part of the recovery process from that. The diet is what facilitates weight loss to the greatest extent, fat loss in this case, right? And what also helps you hold on to muscle when you're losing weight. But without training, the diet, you can't eat your way to a trained body, I guess is what I'm trying to say. The training is the stimulus, and that's why, earlier I said I don't like to use body weight as the metric for success when you're massing or gaining muscle, because then the lifter starts looking at the scale and ignores how the training is going. So, training drives all this shit. I did a million different diets on really shitty training programs when I was younger, and I'd end up in the same place every single time I cut. So
Yeah.
I had a perfect diet, though. I took supplements early on. I take? The multivitamins, amino acids, whey protein, the basics, as they called them. And, I did it without supplements for most of my year's training because I didn't want to pay for them after, when I got over the fascination with them when I was, 18, 19.
Mm-hmm.
But the whole point is I did all sorts of diets, and I was good at gaining weight. I was good at losing weight. And every single time I get under 160 pounds with no notable muscle definition because I was not training. And what I have found is that people that ask a lot of overcomplicated diet questions pertaining to this, like I want to look better, through lifting, they tend to be weak at baseline, then they, if they're willing to be pushed, they get stronger, so this is not me taking a knock at you, but they tend to be weak at baseline and they're just missing the hard training more often than, they're doing something wrong with diet. When it comes to general weight loss, it's another story, but when it comes to, I want a quote unquote beach bod, for lack of a better word, and the person's not necessarily a real fat person,
Right.
We're talking about your skinny fat person. Oftentimes there's just a lack of hard training is what I've kind of seen.
Yeah.
And there's a variety of reasons for that, There's not one singular reason, but that's usually the bottleneck in my experience. It comes on the training side more than the diet side.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's and so if you want some, more details on like, well, how do I make that cut happen? How do I make the, gain happen? What macros should I be eating? Well, you can go back to previous episodes. We've talked about cutting in general, and we've talked about, macronutrient ratios in general, and those principles don't change, right? Those principles are the same, no matter what situation you're in. Right. So that's why we're not going into detail there. What we're really talking about here is it's all context, right? It's all like, specific goals and the context of what situation you're in, what kind of physique you're bringing to the table at the beginning of this process, and what that timeline and what that process is going to look like for you to get to the physique that you want.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. So,
all right. Well, I hope that's been helpful. You want to close this out?
Yeah. Thank you for tuning in to the Weights and Plates podcast. You can find me at weightsandplates.com or on Instagram at _Robert_Santana or weights_and_plates.
Well, fantastic. Well, you know where to find me. If you're interested in online coaching, you can email me at jonesbarbellclub@gmail.com. Or if you just want to follow what I'm doing and what I'm up to, you can go to Instagram and look me up at marmalade_cream. All right, we'll talk to you again in a couple weeks.